Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. One of the questions I've been asked the most is, how much is Penance Brand of Dissipation being nerfed? And it's interesting to note that on first glance, I got these numbers a little bit wrong. So what I've done is I've run some simulations as to how much damage it's going to do in a couple of idealized scenarios. It's not going to do exactly that amount of damage in the real world, but it shouldn't be too far off. The methodology that I used was pretty simplified. The goal here is just to simulate a training dummy, so you're not having to interrupt your DPS in order to dodge anything. And we're not putting absolute numbers on the DPS, it's just a relative comparison to the amount of damage that you are doing in patch 3.23. Let's start by quickly recapping just how busted this skill was. I did a video where I looked at the day 15 meta in patch 3.23 for solo self-found, and the skill that was just exploding up the charts at that point was Penance Brand of Dissipation on the Inquisitor. This was one of the highest damaging skills around, and the longer the league went, the more clear it became that this skill was broken. It's getting a triple tap nerf in patch 3.24. The three aspects that are being nerfed are its base damage, its activation frequency, and how much it scales with the amount of energy on the target. Let's go through those, and then we'll have a look at some charts I've put together that illustrate the amount of damage it's going to do in the new league. That said, it's still going to be a very playable skill. I just don't think you want to play it unless you really like the skill. So, the first part of the nerf, 20% less base damage, or to be exact, 360 base damage at gem level 20 is being nerfed to 289 base damage at gem level 20, and effectiveness of added damage is going from 65% to 50%. So to within a rounding error, this is a 20% nerf to the damage that you get just by leveling up Penance Brand of Dissipation, and a 23% less damage multiplier to sources of flat added damage. People weren't really scaling that on Penance Brand of Dissipation. You might have got some by accident, but it wasn't the main purpose of the skill. It wasn't the way people were building it. So for that reason, I'm just modeling this as a 20% loss. Secondly, there is the activation frequency. This is being nerfed from 600 milliseconds to 750 milliseconds. Now this one's a little bit tricky because Penance Brand of Dissipation has ramp up time. When you're trying to hit a high hit point target, this is the sort of thing that means that the damage you used to do in 12 seconds, you're now doing in 15 seconds. When you take this on its own, this nerf is a 25% increase in time to kill on any given monster, and a 20% nerf to DPS. However, that is not a 20% nerf on any given second, and so this can end up looking quite a bit more complex in general, but the key thing to take away here is that over the life of the monster, it is a 20% nerf to the amount of damage that you're doing. I think the easiest way to visualize this is with the charts that I put together later, and I'll put a link to those charts down in the description below. Post them over on Reddit so you can see them there. Now in 3.23, the skill has a mechanic where the second pulse is 60% better than the first pulse, the third pulse is 120% better than the first pulse, the fourth pulse is 180% better, all the way up to the 20th pulse, which is 1140% better than the first pulse. That is for hit based. And instead of being 60% better each stage, it's 40% better each stage for ailments. In patch 3.24's version of the skill, it's only going to be 30%, and there's going to be no distinction between the hit-based version and the ailment-based version. In short, this is a much more severe cap to how much the skill can scale up in longer fights. The amount of damage that it does per second ends up with a lower cap than it used to have. Now, the ultimate theoretical limit of this, if you were to have an infinite duration brand and you were just to drop it on a boss, it would be almost a 50% nerf to the hit damage and almost a 25% nerf to the ailment damage. But we don't live in that world. We live in the real world where monsters have finite hit points, not an infinite number. So in practice, this is actually less than a 50% nerf. Anyways, let's put it all together, and we've got a little bit of a comparison here. The blue chart shows the damage that Penance Brand of Dissipation did in 3.23. The green chart shows what it does in 3.24, and it's about a 66.3% nerf. Now for comparison, I've put in an orange chart here as well. The orange chart assumes your character stands still in one place and casts Fireball over and over and over again. And just to clarify, this is a hit-based version of Fireball. We're not talking Ignite here, we're just talking about the upfront damage the skill does. You'll notice that Fireball actually takes off a bit faster even than 3.23 Penance Brand of Dissipation, but then quickly gets outclassed by 3.23 Penance Brand of Dissipation. That said, the Fireball spam is much worse than the 3.24 version, because one thing we're not factoring in here is that you can have two brands attached to the monster, which is essentially going to double the amount of damage that you're doing. So you're going to do more damage even with 3.24 Penance Brand of Dissipation than you will with the Fireball spam. Additionally, Penance Brand of Dissipation is the perfect type of damage to scale with auras. So it scales with Hatred, it scales with Wrath, and if you convert the lightning damage into cold, it actually double dips on some of that. whereas the hit component of Fireball doesn't really scale with very much in the way of auras at all. And on top of that, Penance Brand of Dissipation, you're free to spend most of your time actively dodging the boss's skills, whereas with Fireball Spam, you are rooted in place, and therefore you are probably going to get splattered pretty quickly. Now let's have a look at the ailment version, specifically Poison. Now this is something like 52% worse than it was in 3.23 in an infinitely long fight. Now there are two important assumptions that I've made here to simplify the modeling, and that is that I'm assuming infinite duration on your brands, which is not something that's real, and also I've assumed infinite poison speed. The infinite poison speed doesn't matter very much because ultimately the damage that you're doing with poison, once you put it on a monster, it's going to happen eventually anyway. It might just take a little bit longer until your poison duration expires, but essentially that's the amount of damage you've locked in, even if some of it is going to take place in the future. But brand duration is something you may need to invest more in 3.24 than you did in 3.23. What's my final concluding thoughts? The playstyle of Penance Brand of Dissipation is extremely safe, and it also scales incredibly well with auras. If you love the skill, it's still good enough to play. If you don't love the skill, but you did play it because it was OP, then it's not going to be good enough for you to want to play it, but you will still find it serviceable if you do. The one situation where I do think this skill is going to really be good though, is in two-player parties that want to kill bosses early in the league, where you've got one person who's playing an aura support, and the other person is playing a dedicated Penance Brand of Dissipation character. I do think that they're going to be in a strong position to be able to take down hard bosses early. If that's something you're interested in, then this may well be a skill for you. Otherwise, despite the fact that the nerf numbers are so high, 66%-ish on the hit version, 52% on the ailment version, it still was so broken before that it can still be fine even after a nerf like that. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.